True magic comes from within, and is not the result of nimble fingers which trick the eye." The Murgo stared at her, his face hard, and she returned his gaze with steely eyes. To Geryon, sitting nearby, it seemed as if something had passed between them that had nothing to do with the words that they spoke. A kind of challenge seemed to hang in the air. And then the Murgo looked away, almost as if he feared to take up the challenge. When the meal was over, it was time for the rather simple pageant which traditionally marked Iristide. 7 of the older farmhands who had slipped away earlier appeared in the doorway, wearing the long hooded robes and carefully carved and painted masks which represented the faces of the gods. The costumes were old, and showed the wrinkles which were the result of having been packed away in Faldor's attic for the past year. With a slow step, the robed and masked figures paced into the hall, and lined up at the foot of the table where Faldor sat. Then each, in turn, spoke a short piece which identified the god he represented. "I am Aldor," Kralto's voice came from behind the first mask, "the god who dwells alone, and I command this world to be." "I am Balar," came another familiar voice from behind the second mask, "bear god of the Alloans, and I command this world to be." And so it went down the line. Karldan, Issa, Nidra, Mara, and then finally the last figure, which, unlike the others, was robed in black, and whose mask was made of steel instead of painted wood. "I am Torak." Dernick's voice came hollowly from behind the mask, "Dragon god of the Engaroks, and I command this world to be." A movement caught Geryon's eye, and he looked quickly. The Murgo had covered his face with his hands in a strange, almost ceremonial gesture. Beyond him, at the far table, the 5 Tulls were ashen-faced and trembling. The 7 figures at the foot of Faldor's table joined their hands. "We are the gods," they said in unison, "and we command this world to be." "Hearken unto the words of the gods," Faldor declaimed. "Welcome are the gods in the house of Faldor." "The blessings of the gods be upon the house of Faldor," the 7 responded, "and upon all this company." And then they turned, and as slowly as they had come, they paced from the hall. Then came the gifts. There was much excitement at this, for the gifts were all from Faldor, and the good farmer struggled long each year to provide the most suitable gift for each of his people. New tunics and hose and gowns and shoes were much in evidence, but Geryon this year was nearly overwhelmed when he opened a smallish cloth-wrapped bundle and found a neat, well-sheathed dagger. "He's nearly a man," Faldor explained to Aunt Paul, "and a man has always got a need of a good knife." Geryon, of course, immediately tested the edge of his gift and quite promptly managed to cut his finger. "It was inevitable, I suppose," Aunt Paul said, but whether she was speaking of the cut or of the gift itself, or the fact of Geryon's growing up, was not entirely clear. The Murgo bought his hams the next morning, and he and the 5 Thulls departed. A few days later, Anhelda and Heidelberg packed up and left on their return journey to the city of Sundar, and Faldor's farm returned to normal. The winter plodded on, the snows came and went, and spring returned, as it always does. The only thing which made that spring any different from any other was the arrival of Brill, the new hand. One of the younger farmers had married and rented a small nearby croft, and had left, laden down with practical gifts and good advice from Faldor, to begin his life as a married man. Brill was hired to replace him. Geryon found Brill to be a definitely unattractive addition to the farm. The man's tunic and hose were patched and stained, his black hair and scraggly beard were unkempt, and one of his eyes looked off in a different direction from its fellow. He was a sour, solitary man, and he was none too clean. He seemed to carry with him an acrid reek of stale sweat that hung in his vicinity like a miasma. After a few attempts at conversation, Geryon gave up and avoided him. The boy, however, had other things to occupy his mind during that spring and summer. Though he had until then considered her to be more an inconvenience than a genuine playmate, quite suddenly he began to notice Zubrette. He had always known that she was pretty, but until that particular season that fact had been unimportant, and he had much preferred the company of Runderig and Dorun. Now matters had changed. He noticed that the two other boys had also begun to pay more attention to her as well, and for the first time he began to feel the stirrings of jealousy. Zubrette, of course, flirted outrageously with all three of them, and positively glowed when they glared at each other in her presence. Runderig's duties in the fields kept him away most of the time, but Dorun was a serious worry to Geryon. He became quite nervous, and frequently found excuses to go about the compound to make certain that Dorun and Zubrette were not alone together. His own campaign was charmingly simple. He resorted to bribery. Zubrette, like all little girls, was fond of sweets, and Geryon had access to the entire kitchen. In a short period of time they had worked out an arrangement. Geryon would steal sweets from the kitchen for his sunny-haired playmate, and in return she would let him kiss her. Things might perhaps have gone further if Aunt Paul had not caught them in the midst of such an exchange one bright summer afternoon in the seclusion of the hay barn. "That is quite enough of that," she announced firmly from the doorway. Geryon jumped guiltily away from Zubrette. "I've got something in my eye," Zubrette lied quickly. "Geryon was trying to get it out for me." Geryon stood blushing furiously. "Really?" Aunt Paul said. "How interesting." "Come with me, Geryon." He started. "Now, Geryon?" And that was the end of that. Geryon's time thereafter was totally occupied in the kitchen, and Aunt Paul's eyes seemed to be on him every moment. He moaned about a great deal and worried desperately about Dorun, who now appeared hatefully smug, but Aunt Paul remained watchful, and Geryon remained in the kitchen. Chapter 5. In mid-autumn that year, when the leaves had turned and the wind had showered them down from the trees like red and gold snow, when evenings were chill, and the smoke from the chimneys at Faldor's farm rose straight and blue toward the first cold stars in a purpling sky, Wolf returned. He came up the road one gusty afternoon under a lowering autumn sky, with the new fallen leaves tumbling about him, and his great dark cloak whipping in the wind. Geryon, who had been dumping kitchen slop to the pigs, saw his approach and ran to meet him. The old man seemed travel-stained and tired, and his face under his gray hood was grim. His usual demeanor of happy-go-lucky cheerfulness had been replaced by a somber mood that Geryon had never seen in him before. "Geryon," the wolf said by way of greeting, "you have grown, I see." "Well, it has been 5 years. Has it been that long?" Geryon nodded, falling into step beside his friend. "Is everyone well?" "Oh, yes, everything's the same here, except that Braldo got married and moved away, and the old brown cow died last summer." "I remember the cow," the wolf said, and then he said, "I must speak with your Aunt Paul." "Oh, she's not in a very good mood today," Geryon warned. "It might be better if you rested in one of the barns. I can sneak some food and drink to you in a bit." "We will have to chance her mood. What I have to say to her cannot wait." They entered the gate and crossed the courtyard to the kitchen door. Aunt Paul was waiting. "You again?" she said tartly, her hands on her hips. "My kitchen still has not recovered from your last visit." "Mistress Paul," the wolf said, bowing, and then he did a strange thing. His fingers traced an intricate little design in the air in front of his chest. Geryon was quite sure that he was not intended to see those gestures. Aunt Paul's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed, and her face became grim. "How do you—" she started, and then caught herself. "Garyon, I need some carrots. There are still some in the ground at the far end of the kitchen garden. Take a spade and a pail and fetch me some." "But—" he protested, and then, warned by her expression, he left, quickly. He got a spade and pail from a nearby shed and then loitered near the kitchen door. Eavesdropping, of course, was not a nice habit, and was considered the worst sort of bad manners in Cinderia. But Garyon had long ago concluded that whenever he was sent away, the conversation was bound to be very interesting, and would probably concern him rather intimately. He had wrestled briefly with his conscience about it, but since he really saw no harm in the practice, as long as he did not repeat anything he heard, conscience had lost to curiosity. Garyon's ears were very sharp, but it took him a moment or two to separate the two familiar voices from the other sounds in the kitchen. "He won't leave you a trail," Aunt Paul was saying. "He does not have to. The thing itself will make its trail known to me. I can follow it as easily as a fox can scent out the track of a rabbit." "Where will he take it?" "Who can say? His mind's closed to me. My guess is that he will go north to Boktor. That is the shortest route to Garog Nadrak. He will know that I'll be after him, and he will want to cross into the lands of the Angaraks as soon as possible. His theft will not be complete so long as he stays in the west." "And when did it happen?"
4 weeks ago.
"He could already be in the Angarak kingdoms."
"It's not likely. The distances are great. But if he is, I will have to follow him. I'll need your help."
"But how can I leave here? I have to watch over the boy." Garyon's curiosity was becoming almost unbearable. He edged closer to the kitchen door.
"The boy will be safe enough here. This is an urgent matter."
"No," Aunt Paul contradicted. "Even this place is not safe. Last Eristide, a Murgo and 5 tulls came here. He posed as a merchant, but he asked a few too many questions about an old man and a boy named Runderig, who had been seen in Upper Gralt some years ago. He may also have recognized me."
"It is more serious than I thought, then," the wolf said thoughtfully. "We shall have to move the boy. We can leave him with friends elsewhere."
"No," Aunt Paul disagreed again. "If I go with you, he will have to go along. He is reaching an age where he has to be watched most carefully."
"Don't be foolish," the wolf said sharply. Garyon was stunned.
Nobody talked to Aunt Paul that way. "It is my decision to make," Aunt Paul said crisply. "We all agreed that he was to be in my care until he was grown. I won't go unless he goes with me."
Garyon's heart leaped. "Paul, think where we may have to go. You cannot deliver the boy into those hands."
"He would be safer in Ctolmurgos, or in Meloria itself, than he would be here without me to watch him," Aunt Paul responded. "Last spring I caught him in the barn with a girl about his own age. As I said, he needs watching."
The wolf laughed then, a rich, merry sound. "Is that all? You worry too much about such things."
"How would you like it if we returned and found him married and about to become a father?" Aunt Paul demanded. "He'd make an excellent farmer, and what matter if we'd all have to wait 100 years for the circumstances to be right again?"
"Oh, surely it has not gone that far. They are only children."
"You are blind, old wolf. This is back-country Cinderia, and the boy has been raised to do the proper and honorable thing. The girl's a bright-eyed little minx who's maturing much too rapidly for my comfort. Right now, charming little Zubret is a far greater danger than any Murgo could ever be. Either the boy goes along, or I won't go either. You have your responsibilities, and I have mine."
"There is no time to argue. If it has to be this way, then so be it."
Garyon almost choked with excitement. He felt only a passing, momentary pang at leaving Zubret behind. He turned and looked exultantly up at the clouds scudding across the evening sky, and, because his back was turned, he did not see Aunt Paul approach through the kitchen door. "The garden, as I recall, lies beyond the south wall," she pointed out. Geryon started guiltily. "How is it that the carrots remain undug?" "I had to look for the spade," he said unconvincingly. "Really? I see that you found it, however." Her eyebrows arched dangerously. "Only just now." "Splendid. Carrots, Geryon. Now."
Geryon grabbed his spade and pail and ran.
It was just dusk when he returned, and he saw Aunt Paul mounting the steps that led to Faldor's quarters. He might have followed her to listen, but a faint movement in the dark doorway of one of the sheds made him step instead into the shadow of the gate. A furtive figure moved from the shed to the foot of the stairs that Aunt Paul had just climbed, and silently crept up the stairs as soon as she went into Faldor's door. The light was fading, and Geryon could not see exactly who followed his aunt. He set down his pail, and, grasping the spade like a weapon, he hurried quickly around the inner court, keeping to the shadows. There came the sound of a movement inside the chambers upstairs, and the figure at the door straightened quickly and scurried down the steps. Geryon slipped back out of sight, his spade still held at the ready. As the figure passed him, Geryon briefly caught the scent of stale, musty clothing and rank sweat. As certainly as if he had seen the man's face, he knew that the figure that had followed his aunt had been Brill, the new farmhand. The door at the top of the stairs opened, and Geryon heard his aunt's voice. "I'm sorry, Faldor, but it is a family matter, and I must leave immediately."
"I would pay you more, Paul." Faldor's voice was almost breaking.
"Money has nothing to do with it," Aunt Paul replied. "You are a good man, Faldor, and your farm has been a haven to me when I needed one. I am grateful to you, more than you can know. But I must leave."
"Perhaps when this family business is over, you can come back," Faldor almost pleaded.
"No, Faldor, I am afraid not."
"We will miss you, Paul," Faldor said with tears in his voice.
"And I will miss you, dear Faldor. I have never met a better-hearted man. I would take it kindly if you would not mention my leaving until I've gone. I am not fond of explanations or sentimental goodbyes."
"Well, whatever you wish, then, Paul."
"Oh, don't look so mournful, old friend," Aunt Paul said lightly. "My helpers are well trained. Their cooking will be the same as mine. Your stomach will never know the difference."
"Oh, but my heart will," Faldor said.
"Oh, don't be silly. Now, I must see to supper."
Geryon moved quickly away from the foot of the stairs. Troubled, he put his spade back in the shed and fetched the pail of carrots he had left sitting by the gate. To reveal to his aunt that he had seen Brill listening at the door would immediately raise questions about his own activities that he would prefer not to have to answer. In all probability, Brill was merely curious, and there was nothing menacing or ominous about that. To observe the unsavory Brill duplicating his own seemingly harmless pastime, however, made Geryon quite uncomfortable, even slightly ashamed of himself. Although Geryon was much too excited to eat, supper that evening seemed as ordinary as any meal on Faldor's farm had ever been. Geryon covertly watched sour-faced Brill, but the man showed no outward sign of having in any way been changed by the conversation he had gone to so much trouble to overhear. When supper was over, as was always the case when he visited the farm, Mr. Wolf was prevailed upon to tell a story. He rose and stood for a moment deep in thought as the wind moaned in the chimney and the torches flickered in their rings on the pillars in the hall. "As all men know," he began, "the Marags are no more, and the spirit of Mara weeps alone in the wilderness, and wails among the moss-grown ruins of Maragor. But also, as all men know, the hills and streams of Maragor are heavy with fine yellow gold. That gold, of course, was the cause of the destruction of the Marags. When a certain neighboring kingdom became aware of the gold, the temptation became too great, and the result, as it almost always is when gold is an issue between kingdoms, was war. The pretext for the war was the lamentable fact that the Marags were cannibals. While this habit is distasteful to civilized men, had there not been gold in Maragor, it might have been overlooked. The war, however, was inevitable, and the Marags were slain. But the spirit of Mara and the ghosts of all of the slaughtered Marags remained in Maragor, as those who went into that haunted kingdom soon discovered. Now it chanced to happen that about that time there lived in the town of Muros, in southern Sandaria, 3 adventuresome men, and, hearing of all that gold, they resolved to journey down to Maragor to claim their share of it. The men, as I said, were adventuresome and bold, and they scoffed at the tales of ghosts. Their journey was long, for it is many hundreds of leagues from Muros to the upper reaches of Maragor. But the smell of the gold drew them on, and so it happened one dark and stormy night that they crept across the border into Maragor, past the patrols which had been set to turn back just such as they. That nearby kingdom, having gone to all the expense and inconvenience of war, was quite naturally reluctant to share the gold with anyone who chanced to pass by. Through the night they crept, burning with their lust for gold. The spirit of Mara wailed about them, but they were brave men and not afraid of spirits. And besides, they told each other, the sound was not truly a spirit, merely the moaning of the wind in the trees. As dim and misty morning seeped amongst the hills, they could hear not far away the rushing sound of a river. As all men know, gold is most easily found along the banks of rivers, and so they made quickly toward the sound. Then one of them chanced to look down in the dim light, and behold, the ground at his feet was strewn with gold, lumps and chunks of it. Overcome with greed, he remained silent and loitered behind, until his companions were out of sight. And then he fell to his knees, and began to gather up gold as a child might pick the flowers. He heard a sound behind him, and he turned. What he saw, it is best not to say. Dropping all his gold, he bolted. Now, the river, they had heard, cut through a gorge, just about there, and his 2 companions were amazed to see him run off the edge of that gorge, and even continue to run as he fell, his legs churning insubstantial air. Then they turned, and they saw what had been pursuing him. One went quite mad and leaped with a despairing cry into the same gorge which had just claimed his companion. But the 3rd adventurer, the bravest and boldest of all, told himself that no ghost could actually hurt a living man, and he stood his ground. That, of course, was the worst mistake of all. The ghosts encircled him as he stood bravely, certain that they could not hurt him. Mr. Wolf paused and drank briefly from his tankard. And then, the old storyteller continued, because even ghosts can become hungry, They divided him up and ate him." Gerion's hair stood on end at the shocking conclusion of Wolf's tale, and he could sense the others at his table shuddering. It was not at all the kind of story they had expected to hear. Jernick, the smith, who was sitting nearby, had a perplexed expression on his plain face. Finally, he spoke. "I would not question the truth of your story for the world," he said to Wolf, struggling with his words. "But if they ate him, the ghosts, I mean, where did it go? I mean, if ghosts are insubstantial, as all men say that they are, not having stomachs, do they? And what would they bite with?" Wolf's face grew sly and mysterious. He raised one finger, as if he were about to make some cryptic reply to Jernick's puzzled question, and then he suddenly began to laugh. Jernick looked annoyed at first, and then, rather sheepishly, he too began to laugh. Slowly the laughter spread as they all began to understand the joke. "An excellent jest, old friend," Faldor said, laughing as hard as any of the others, "and one from which much instruction might be gained. Greed is bad, but fear is worse, and the world is dangerous enough without cluttering it with imaginary hobgoblins." Trusts Faldor to twist a good story into a moralistic sermon of some kind. "True enough, good Faldor," Wolf said more seriously. "But there are things in this world which cannot be explained away, nor dismissed with laughter." Brill, seated near the fire, had not joined in the laughter. "I've never seen a ghost," he said sourly, "nor ever met anyone who has, and I for one don't believe in any kind of magic or sorcery or such childishness." And he stood up and stamped out of the hall, almost as if the story had been a kind of personal insult. Later, in the kitchen, when Aunt Paul was seeing to the cleaning up and Wolf lounged against one of the work tables with a tankard of beer, Gerion's struggle with his conscience finally came into the open. That dry, interior voice informed him most pointedly that concealing what he had seen was not merely foolish, but possibly dangerous as well. He set down the pot he was scrubbing and crossed to where they were. "It might not be important," he said carefully, "but this afternoon, when I was coming back from the garden, I saw Brill following you, Aunt Paul." She turned and looked at him. Wolf set down his tankard. "Go on, Gerion," Aunt Paul said. "It was when you went up to talk with Faldor," Gerion explained. "He waited until you'd gone up the stairs and Faldor had let you in, and then he sneaked up and listened at the door. I saw him up there when I went to put the spade away." "How long has this Brill been at the farm?" the wolf asked, frowning. "He just came last spring, after Breldo got married and moved away." "And that Murgo merchant was here at Eristide some months before?" Aunt Paul looked at him sharply. "You think?" She did not finish. "I think it might not be a bad idea if I stepped around and had a few words with friend Brill," the wolf said grimly. "Do you know where his room is, Gerion?" Gerion nodded, his heart suddenly racing. "Show me." The wolf moved away from the table against which he had been lounging, and his step was no longer the step of an old man. It was curiously as if the years had suddenly dropped away from him. "Be careful." The wolf chuckled, and the sound was chilling. "I am always careful, Paul. You should know that by now." Gerion quickly led Wolf out into the yard and around to the far end, where the steps mounted to the gallery that led to the rooms of the farmhands. They went up, their soft leather shoes making no sound on the worn steps. "Down here," Gerion whispered, not knowing exactly why he whispered. The wolf nodded, and they went quietly down the dark gallery. "Here," Garion whispered, stopping. "Step back," Wolf breathed. He touched the door with his fingertips. "Is it locked?" "That is no problem." The wolf put his hand to the latch. There was a click, and the door swung open. Wolf stepped inside, with Garion close behind. It was totally dark in the room, and the sour stink of Brill's unwashed clothes hung in the air. "He is not here," the wolf said in a normal tone. He fumbled with something at his belt, and there was the scrape of flint against steel, and a flare of sparks. A wisp of frayed rope caught the sparks and began to glow. Wolf blew on the spark for a second, and it flared into flame. He raised the burning wisp over his head and looked around the empty room. The floor and bed were littered with rumpled clothes and personal belongings. Garion knew instantly that this was not simple untidiness, but rather was the sign of a hasty departure, and he did not know exactly how it was that he knew it. Wolf stood for a moment, holding his little torch. His face seemed somehow empty, as if his mind were searching for something. "The stables," he said sharply. "Quickly, boy." Garion turned and dashed from the room with Wolf close behind. The burning wisp of rope drifted down into the yard, illuminating it briefly after Wolf discarded it over the railing as he ran. There was a light in the stable. It was dim, partially covered, but faint beams shone through the weathered cracks in the door. The horses were stirring uneasily. "Stay clear, boy," Wolf said as he jerked the stable door open. Brill was inside, struggling to saddle a horse that shied from his rank smell. "Leaving, Brill?" Wolf asked, stepping into the doorway with his arms crossed. Brill turned quickly, crouched with a snarl on his unshaven face. His off-center eye gleamed whitely in the half-muffled light of the lantern hanging from a peg on one of the stalls, and his broken teeth shone behind his pulled-back lips. "A strange time for a journey," the wolf said dryly. "Don't interfere with me, old man. You will regret it." "Oh, I've regretted many things in my life. I doubt that one more is going to make all that much difference." "I warned you," Brill snarled, and his hand dove under his cloak and emerged with a short, rust-splotched sword. "Oh, don't be stupid," the wolf said, in a tone of overwhelming contempt. Garion, however, at the first flash of the sword, whipped his hand to his belt, drew his dagger, and stepped in front of the unarmed old man. "Get back, boy," the wolf barked. But Garion had already lunged forward, his bright dagger thrust out ahead of him. Later, when he had had time to consider, he could not have explained why he reacted as he did. Some deep instinct seemed to take over. "Garion, get out of the way!" "So much the better," Brill said, raising his sword. And then Dernick was there. He appeared as if from nowhere, snatched up an ox yoke, and struck the sword from Brill's hand. Brill turned on him, enraged, and Dernick's second blow took the cast-eyed man in the ribs, a little below the armpit. The breath whooshed from Brill's lungs, and he collapsed, gasping and writhing, to the straw-littered floor. "For shame, Garion," Dernick said reproachfully. "I didn't make that knife of yours for this kind of thing." "He was going to kill Mr. Wolf," Garion protested. "Never mind that," the wolf said, bending over the gasping man on the floor of the stable. He searched Brill roughly and pulled a jingling purse out from under the stained tunic. He carried the purse to the lantern and opened it. "That's mine," Brill gasped, trying to rise. Dernick raised the ox yoke and Brill sank back again. "A sizable sum for an ordinary farm hand to have, friend Brill," Wolf said, pouring the jingling coins from the purse into his hand. "How did you manage to come by it?" Brill glared at him. Garion's eyes grew wide at the sight of the coins. He had never seen gold before. You don't really need to answer, friend Brill, the wolf said, examining one of the coins. Your gold speaks for you. He dumped the coins back in the purse and tossed the small leather pouch back to the man on the floor. Brill grabbed it quickly and pushed it back inside his tunic. I'll have to tell Faldor of this, Dernick said. No, the wolf said. It's a serious matter. A bit of wrestling or a few blows exchanged is one thing, but drawing weapons, that's quite another. There's no time for all of that, the wolf said, taking a piece of harness strap from a peg on the wall. Tie his hands behind him, and we'll put him in one of the grain bins. Someone will find him in the morning. Dernick stared at him. Trust me, good Dernick. The matter's urgent. Tie him up and hide him someplace, and then come to the kitchen. Come with me, Geryon. And he turned and left the stable. Aunt Pole was pacing her kitchen nervously when they returned. Well, she demanded. He was trying to leave. We stopped him. Did you? She left it hanging. No. He drew a sword, but Dernick happened to be nearby and knocked the belligerents out of him. The intervention was timely. Your cub here was about to do battle. That little dagger of his is a pretty thing, but not really much of a match for a sword. Aunt Pole turned on Geryon, her eyes ablaze. Geryon prudently stepped back out of reach. There's no time for that, the wolf said, retrieving the tankard he had set down before leaving the kitchen. Brill had a pouch full of good red Angarek gold. The Murghas have set eyes to watching this place. I had wanted to make our going less noticeable. But since we are already being watched, there's no point in that now. Gather what you and the boy are likely to need. I want a few leagues between us and Brill before he manages to free himself. I do not want to be looking over my shoulder for Murghas every place I go. Dernick, who had just come into the kitchen, stopped and stood, staring at them. Things aren't what they seem here. What manner of folk are you? And how is it that you have such dangerous enemies? It's a long story, good Dernick. But I'm afraid there's no time to tell it now. We make our apologies to Faldor, and see if you cannot detain Brill for a day or so. I'd like our trail to be quite cold before he or his friends try to find it. Someone else is going to have to do that, Dernick said. I'm not sure what this is all about, but I am sure that there's danger involved in it. It appears that I'll have to go with you, at least until I've gotten you safely away from here. Aunt Pole suddenly laughed. You, Dernick? You mean to protect us? He drew himself up. I am sorry, Mistress Pole. I will not permit you to go unescorted. Will not permit, she said incredulously. Very well, the wolf said, a sly look on his face. Have you totally taken leave of your senses? Aunt Pole demanded, turning on him. Dernick has shown himself to be a useful man, the wolf replied. If nothing else, he will give me someone to talk with along the way. Your tongue has grown sharper with the years, Paul, and I do not relish the idea of 100 leagues or more with nothing but abuse for companionship. I see that you have finally slipped into your dotage, old wolf. Well, that's exactly the sort of thing I mean, the wolf replied blindly. And now, gather a few necessary things, and let's be away from here. The night's passing rapidly. She glared at him a moment and then stormed out of the kitchen. I'll have to go fetch some things too, Dernick said. He turned and went out into the gusty night. Geryon's mind whirled. Things were happening far too fast. Afraid, boy? The wolf asked. Well, it's just that I don't understand. I don't understand any of this at all. You will, in time, Geryon. For now, it's better perhaps that you don't. There's danger in what we are doing, but not all that great a danger. Your aunt and I, and good Dernick, of course, will see that no harm comes to you. Now, help me in the pantry." He took a lantern into the pantry and began loading some loaves of bread, a ham, a round yellow cheese, and several bottles of wine into a sack which he took down from a peg. It was nearly midnight, as closely as Geryon could tell, when they quietly left the kitchen and crossed the dark courtyard. The faint creak of the gate as Dernick swung it open seemed enormously loud. As they passed through the gate, Geryon felt a momentary pang. Faldor's farm had been the only home he had ever known. He was leaving now, perhaps forever, and such things had great significance. He felt an even sharper pang at the memory of Zubret. The thought of Doron and Zubret together in the hay barn almost made him want to give the whole thing up altogether, but it was far too late for that now. Beyond the protection of the buildings, the gusty wind was chill and whipped at Geryon's cloak. Heavy clouds covered the moon, and the road seemed only slightly less dark than the surrounding fields. It was cold and lonely, and more than a little frightening. He walked a bit closer to Aunt Paul. At the top of the hill, he stopped and glanced back. Faldor's farm was only a pale, dim blur in the valley behind. Regretfully, he turned his back on it. The valley ahead was very dark, and even the road was lost in the gloom before them. Chapter 6. They had walked for miles, how many Geryon could not say. He nodded as he walked and sometimes stumbled over unseen stones on the dark road. More than anything now, he wanted to sleep. His eyes burned and his legs trembled on the verge of exhaustion. At the top of another hill there always seemed to be another hill, for that part of Sindaria was folded like a rumpled cloth. Mr. Wolf stopped and looked about, his eyes searching the oppressive gloom. "We'll turn aside from the road here," he announced. "Is that wise?" Dernick asked. "There are woods hereabout, and I have heard that there may be robbers hiding there. Even if there aren't any robbers, aren't we likely to lose our way in the dark?" He looked up at the murky sky, his plain face dimly seen, troubled. "I wish there was a moon." "I don't think we need to be afraid of robbers," the wolf said confidently. "And I'm just as happy that there isn't a moon. I don't think we're being followed yet, but it's just as well that no one happens to see us pass. Murga gold can buy most secrets." And with that he led them into the fields that lay beside the road. For Geryon the fields were impossible. If he had stumbled now and then on the road, the unseen furrows, holes, and clumps in the rough ground seemed to catch at his feet with every step. At the end of a mile, when they reached the black edge of the woods, he was almost ready to weep with exhaustion. "How can we find our way in there?" he demanded, peering into the utter darkness of the woods. "There's a woodcutter's track not far to this side," Wolf said, pointing. "We only have a little farther to go." And he set off again, following the edge of that dark woods with Geryon and the others stumbling along behind him. "Here we are," he said finally, stopping to allow them to catch up. "It's going to be very dark in there, and the track is not wide. I'll go first, and the rest of you follow me." "I'll be right behind you, Geryon," Dernick said. "Don't worry. Everything'll be all right." There was a note in the smith's voice, however, that hinted that his words were more to reassure himself than to calm the boy. It seemed warmer in the woods. The trees sheltered them from the gusty wind, but it was so dark that Geryon could not understand how Wolf could possibly find his way. A dreadful suspicion grew in his mind that Wolf actually did not know where he was going, and was merely floundering along blindly, trusting to luck. "Stop," a rumbling voice suddenly, shockingly said, directly ahead of them. Gerion's eyes, accustomed slightly now to the gloom of the woods, saw a vague outline of something so huge that it could not possibly be a man. "A giant!" he screamed in a sudden panic. Then, because he was exhausted, and because everything that had happened that evening had simply piled too much upon him all at one time, his nerve broke, and he bolted into the trees. "Gerion!" Aunt Paul's voice cried out after him. "Come back!" But panic had taken hold of him. He ran on, falling over roots and bushes, crashing into trees and tangling his legs in brambles. It seemed like some endless nightmare of blind flight. He ran full tilt into a low-hanging, unseen branch, and sparks flared before his eyes with a sudden blow to his forehead. He lay on the damp earth, gasping and sobbing, trying to clear his head. And then there were hands on him, horrid, unseen hands. 1,000 terrors flashed through his mind at once, and he struggled desperately, trying to draw his dagger. "Oh, no," a voice said. "None of that, my rabbit." His dagger was taken from him. Are you going to eat me?" Gerion babbled, his voice breaking. His captor laughed. "On your feet now, rabbit," he said, and Gerion felt himself pulled up by a strong hand. His arm was taken in a firm grasp, and he was half dragged through the woods. Somewhere ahead there was a light, a winking fire among the trees, and it seemed that he was being taken that way. He knew that he must think, must devise some means of escape, but his mind, stunned by fright and exhaustion, refused to function. There were 3 wagons sitting in a rough half-circle around the fire. Dernick was there, and Wolf, and Aunt Paul, and with them a man so huge that Gerion's mind simply refused to accept the possibility that he was real. His tree-trunk-sized legs were wrapped in furs cross-tied with leather thongs, and he wore a chain-mail shirt that reached to his knees, belted at the waist. From the belt hung a ponderous sword on one side and a short-handled axe on the other. His hair was in braids, and he had a vast, bristling red beard. As they came into the light, Gerion was able to see the man who had captured him. He was a small man, scarcely taller than Gerion himself, and his face was dominated by a long, pointed nose. His eyes were small and squinted, and his straight black hair was raggedly cut. The face was not the sort to inspire confidence, and the man's stained and patched tunic and short, wicked-looking sword did little to contradict the implications of the face. "Here's our rabbit," the small, weasel-like man announced as he pulled Gerion into the circle of the firelight. "And a merry chase he led me to." Aunt Paul was furious. "Don't you ever do that again," she said sternly to Gerion. "Not so quick, Mistress Paul. It's better for him to run than to fight just yet. Until he is bigger, his feet are his best friends." Have we been captured by robbers?" Gerion asked in a quavering voice. "Robbers?" the wolf laughed. "What a wild imagination you have, boy. These 2 are our friends."
"Friends?"
Gerion asked doubtfully, looking suspiciously at the red-bearded giant and the weasel-faced man beside him.
"Are you sure?"
The giant laughed then, too, his voice rumbling like an earthquake. "The boy seems mistrustful. What a face must have warned him, friend Silk." The smaller man looked sourly at his burly companion. "This is Gerion," the wolf said, pointing at the boy. "You already know, Mistress Paul." His voice seemed to stress Aunt Paul's name. "And this is Dernick, a brave smith who has decided to accompany us."
"Mistress Paul?" the smaller man said, laughing suddenly for no apparent reason. "I am so known," Aunt Paul said pointedly.
"It shall be my pleasure to call you so then, great lady," the small man said with a mocking bow.
"Our large friend here is Barak," Wolf went on. "He is useful to have around when there's trouble. As you can see, he's not a Sindar, but a Cherek from Val Elorn." Gerion had never seen a Cherek before, and the fearful tales of their prowess in battle became suddenly quite believable in the presence of the towering Barak.
"And I," the small man said, with one hand to his chest, "am called Silk. Not much of a name, I'll admit, but it suits me. And I'm from Boktor in Dresnia. I'm a juggler and an acrobat."
"And also a thief and a spy," Barak rumbled good-naturedly.
"Well, we do all have our faults," Silk admitted blandly, scratching at his scraggly whiskers.
"And I am called Mr. Wolf, in this particular time and place," the old man said. "I'm rather fond of the name, since the boy there gave it to me."
"Mr. Wolf?" Silk asked, and then he laughed again. "What a merry name for you, old friend."
"I'm delighted that you find it so, old friend," the wolf said flatly.
"Mr. Wolf it shall be, then. Come to the fire, friends, warm yourselves, and I'll see to some food."
Gerion was still uncertain about the oddly matched pair. They obviously knew Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf, and just as obviously by different names. The fact that Aunt Paul might not be whom he had always thought she was very disturbing. One of the foundation stones of his entire life had just disappeared. The food which Silk brought was rough, a turnip stew with thick chunks of meat floating in it, and crudely hacked-off slabs of bread, but Gerion, amazed at the size of his appetite, fell into it as if he had not eaten for days. And then, his stomach and his feet warmed by the crackling campfire, he sat on a log, half dozing.
"What now, old wolf?" he heard Aunt Paul ask. "What's the idea behind these clumsy wagons?"
"A brilliant plan," the wolf said, "even if I do say it myself. There are, as you know, wagons going every which way in Sandaria at this time of year. Harvests are moving from field to farm to village, and from village to town. Nothing is more unremarkable in Sandaria than wagons. They are so common that they are almost invisible. This is how we are going to travel. We are now honest freight haulers."
"We are what?"
"Wagoneers," the wolf said expansively. "Hard-working transporters of the goods of Sandaria, out to make our fortunes and seek adventure. Bitten by the desire to travel, incurably infected by the romance of the road."
"Have you any idea how long it takes to travel by wagon?" Aunt Paul asked.
6 to 10 leagues a day. Slow, I'll grant you, but it's better to move slowly than to attract attention."
She shook her head with disgust.
"Where first, Mr. Wolf?"
"To Darin," Wolf announced. "If the one we are following went to the north, he will have had to pass through Darin on his way to Boktor and beyond."
"And what exactly are we carrying to Darin?"
"Turnips, great lady. Last morning my large friend and I purchased 3 wagon loads of them in the village of Winold."
"Turnips?"
Aunt Paul asked, in a tone that spoke volumes.
"Oh, yes, great lady. Turnips."
"Are we ready, then?" "We are,"
the giant Barak said shortly, rising with his mail shirt clinking.
"We should look the part," the wolf said carefully, eyeing Barak up and down. "Your armor, my friend, is not the sort of garb an honest wagoner would wear. I think you should change it for stout wool."
Barak's face looked injured.
"I could
Wear a tunic over it,
he suggested tentatively. You rattle, Silk pointed out, and armor has a distinctive fragrance about it. From the downwind side, you smell like a rusty ironworks barrack.
I feel undressed without a mail shirt,
Barrack complained. Well, we must all make sacrifices, said Silk. Grumbling, Barrack went to one of the wagons, jerked out a bundle of clothes, and began to pull off his mail shirt. His linen undertunic bore large reddish rust stains. I would change tunics as well. Your shirt smells as bad as the armor. Barrack glowered at him.
Anything else? I hope for decency's sake you don't plan to strip me entirely.
Silk laughed. Barrack pulled off his tunic. His torso was enormous and covered with thick red hair. You look like a rug, Silk observed.
I can't help that. Winters are cold in Karak, and the hair helps me to stay warm.
He put on a fresh tunic. It is just as cold in Drasnia. Are you absolutely sure your grandmother didn't dally with a bear during one of those long winters?
Someday, your mouth is going to get you into a great deal of trouble, friend Silk.
Silk laughed again. I have been in trouble most of my life, friend Barrack.
I wonder why. I think all of this could be discussed later, the wolf said pointedly. I'd rather like to be away from here before the week's out, if we can.
Of course, old friend. Barrack and I can amuse each other later. 3 teams of sturdy horses were picketed nearby, and they all helped to harness them to the wagons. I'll put out the fire, Silk said, and fetched 2 pails of water from a small brook that trickled nearby. The fire hissed when the water struck it, and great clouds of steam boiled up toward the low-hanging tree limbs.
We'll lead the horses to the edge of the wood. I'd rather not pick my teeth on a low branch, said Wolf.
The horses seemed almost eager to start, and moved without urging along a narrow track through the dark woods. They stopped at the edge of the open fields, and Wolf looked around carefully to see if anyone was in sight.
I don't see anybody. Let's get moving. Ride with me, good smith,
Barrack said to Dernick.
Conversation with an honest man is much preferable to a night spent enduring the insults of an over-clever Drasnian.
As you wish, friend, Dernick said politely. I'll lead. I am familiar with the back roads and lanes hereabouts, said Silk. I shall put us on the high road beyond Upper Grout before noon. Barrack and Dernick can bring up the rear. I'm sure that between them they can discourage anyone who might feel like following us.
All right,
said the wolf, climbing up onto the seat of the middle wagon. He reached down his hand and helped up Aunt Paul. Gerion quickly climbed up onto the wagon bed behind them, a trifle nervous that someone might suggest that he ride with Silk. It was all very well for Mr. Wolf to say that the 2 they had just met were friends, but the fright he had suffered in the wood was still too fresh in his mind to make him quite comfortable with them. The sacks of musty-smelling turnips were lumpy, but Gerion soon managed to push and shove a kind of half-reclining seat for himself among them, just behind Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf. He was sheltered from the wind. Aunt Paul was close, and his cloak, spread over him, kept him warm. He was altogether comfortable, and despite the excitement of the night's events, he soon drifted into a half-drowse. The dry voice in his mind suggested briefly that he had not behaved too well back in the wood, but it too soon fell silent, and Gerion slept. It was the change of sound that woke him. The soft thud of the horses' hooves on the dirt road became a clatter as they came to the cobblestones of a small village, sleeping in the last chill hours of the autumn night. Gerion opened his eyes and looked sleepily at the tall, narrow houses with their tiny windows all dark. A dog barked briefly, then retreated back to his warm place under some stairs. Gideon wondered what village it might be, and how many people slept under those steep-peaked tile roofs, unaware of the passage of their 3 wagons. The cobbled street was very narrow, and Gideon could almost have reached out and touched the weathered stones of the houses as they passed. And then the nameless village was behind them, and they were back on the road again. The soft sound of the horses' hooves lured him once more toward sleep. "What if he hasn't passed through Derrin?" Aunt Paul asked Mr. Wolf in a low tone. It occurred to Gideon that in all the excitement he had never actually found out exactly what it was that they were seeking. He kept his eyes closed and listened.
"Do not start with the what-ifs," said the wolf irritably. "If we sit around saying, 'What if?' we will never do anything."
"I was merely asking."
"If he has not gone through Derrin, we'll turn south to Muros. He may have joined a caravan there to take the Great North Road to Boktor."
"And if he has not gone through Muros?"
"Then we go on to Kamar."
"And then?"
"We will see when we get to Kamar."
His tone was final, as if he no longer wished to discuss the matter. Aunt Paul drew in a breath as if she were about to deliver some final retort, but apparently she decided against it, and settled back instead on the wagon seat. To the east, ahead of them, the faint stain of dawn touched the lowering clouds, and they moved on through the tattered, wind-swept end of the long night in their search for something which, though he could not yet even identify it, was so important that Gideon's entire life had been uprooted in a single day because of it. Chapter 7. It took them 4 days to reach Derrin on the north coast. The first day went quite well, since, though it was cloudy, and the wind kept blowing, the air was dry and the roads were good. They passed quiet farmsteads, and an occasional farmer bent to his labor in the middle of a field. Inevitably, each man stopped his work to watch them pass. Some waved, some did not. And then there were villages, clusters of tall houses nestled in valleys. As they passed, the children came out and ran after the wagons, shouting with excitement. The villagers watched, idly curious, until it became obvious that the wagons were not going to stop, and then they sniffed and went back to their own concerns. As afternoon of that first day lowered toward evening, Silk led them into a grove of trees at the roadside, and they made preparations for the night. They ate the last of the ham and cheese that Wolf had filched from Faldor's pantry, and then spread their blankets on the ground beneath the wagons.
This ends Disc 3. Please change to Disc 4.